In this video, we want to talk about the relationship between the business environment and employee relations. First of all, let's consider the changing business environment. Well, the concept of employee relations relies on a system which comprises of stakeholders. And of course, by stakeholders we mean employees, employers, and the government. But in fact, we could extend the list of stakeholders to include the local community, the suppliers of raw materials or of semi-processed goods to the company, perhaps outsourced distribution networks. So there are a wide variety of stakeholders, and each of them will have different requirements from the organization or of the organization, and each of them will make particular contributions to the organization. So as the stakeholders change and as the requirements of the stakeholders change, it will clearly impact on the company, on the organization, and that of course will make changes to the relationship the company has with its employees. So there is a connection right through from stakeholders to employees that should be borne in mind. The stakeholders work within an environment which consists of the political, economic, social, legal and technological factors. You'll recognize this as PESTEL, and that's the subject matter of separate videos on the course. But the stakeholders work within this framework, the framework of the political environment, the policies of the government, the direction in which the government is moving the country, the economic, the forces of economics they're international, so that the forces that impinge upon the company may come from outside of the country, or they may be related to fiscal policy or monetary policy within the country. It can come from a wide variety of sources. The social structure of the country, of course, can be changing. There could be new fashions and new trends, new ways of living, new ways of thinking. And of course the legal framework of the country will also impinge upon the business. The laws of contract and tort, for example. And also of course technological factors. We live in an era when there seems to be rapid technological change. We live in an era where technology is ever changing, and it's doing it almost at an increasing pace. So we've seen the introduction of computers and robotics and computer-aided manufacturing and the impact that has had on workforces up and down the country. But we've also seen the internet and communications and the efficiencies that can come around through better communications. So stakeholders work within a very wide range of influences: political, economic, social, legal, technological, and these need to be borne in mind. That's the framework within which stakeholders operate. Now, stakeholders work within an environment to determine a set of rules and guidance within the workplace and establish best practice. So the stakeholders within the company, they work within the environment in which they find themselves, the wider environment, the political, economic, etc., social, legal and technological. They work within that environment, and they are aware of the forces that are in play. But what they need to do is to look for guidance and look for direction and try to establish best practice from all that's around them, try to establish best practice within the company. That may mean adopting a particular type of technology, embracing that technology, introducing it and hopefully getting a benefit in terms of higher productivity as a consequence. It could be that the stakeholders have to understand the political pressures that the country is under and what the government is trying to do and what the opposition say the government should be doing. And so it may be that that impacts on the labour force. It could be that the government is committed to more globalization. That would certainly impact on the labour force and may impact on the way the labour force look at the company and look at the job security that they crave for, they want. But if the government's committed to opening up new markets, then perhaps jobs within the country will become more vulnerable. So the stakeholders work within this wider environment, but what they're trying to do is to try to pick best practice for their own organisation, but also try to understand how the wider political, economic, social, the wider pestle factors will impinge upon them and the organisation. Employee relations can be seen as a subsystem of the wider society which exercises control and constraints within the norms of that society. So employee relations is essentially the relationship between management and the workforce. But the types of relations they've got will be reflected in the types of relations that are approved by the wider society, the types of contexts, the cultural influences, the respect that each show each other, and the understanding that you should bring to bear on in terms of the functions that they perform. So the wider society have norms, they have ways of living which are approved of by the society, and the employee relations within the company will reflect those norms. The way people speak to each other, the respect they pay to each other, the understanding they've got of each other's position. So we can see employee relations as a subsystem of the wider society. The environment in which the organisation operates has a major impact on industrial relations. Well, clearly it depends on the sophistication of the society, to what extent the legal system has been developed, to what extent the issues of human rights and dignity at work and health and safety and job protection, and to what extent have these been encoded in law. And the organisation must work within the law. So the environment in which the organisation finds itself will have a major impact on industrial relations and on employee relations, but in a wider. Industrial relations is the old-fashioned term for employee relations. It really referred to industry. But as more and more employees now work in the service sector, work in offices and hotels and so on, we talk about employee relations. But the point is that the employee relations will be determined by the environment. It'll be determined by the environment because the environment determines how management see the employees and how the rules and norms of the society are translated into the workplace. It's vital that management identify and understand environmental changes and how they will impact on the organisation and their workforce. So the management must understand environmental changes. Environmental changes being changes in the legal system, changes in the political system, changes in economic relationships, changes in markets. So the management must be aware of all of these changes so that it can maneuver the business through all of the turbulence that may be existing in the environment. And in that way the employees can keep their jobs and have job security. And they'll have more affinity, more relationship with the business. So the management must identify and understand environmental changes. They can't live in a cocoon. They don't live in a cocoon. They can't. They can't isolate themselves from the wider society. They operate within that society. So they must understand the processes and changes that are taking place within the society. Let's look at the economic. We'll go through a pest type analysis now of the changing business side. So we'll look at some of the major changes under various headings, like economic, for example. The overall country economic condition plays a major role. Organisations are directly affected by changing economic conditions. So if the country is entering into a recession, it means there's less consumer expenditure, there may be less demand for its products, the company's products, and there may be less demand for labour as a consequence. It may be the country's entering into a boom period, so there may be the onset of inflation, which will in part destroy signals within the economic system, signals in the form of prices. When we go through periods of stability, we all get to know what the prices of products are. We know what the price of raw materials are, perhaps, or the price of final goods. But in times of inflation, prices will change. They will go up. Inflation will cause prices to rise. That's what inflation is, just generally a rise in prices. But this, of course, means that the buying section of the business will have to find out what the new prices are, renegotiate contracts, and the impact of the higher, perhaps, raw material prices because of inflation will have an impact on the price of the good itself, which may cause problems for marketing. So the wider economic climate determines a lot of the behaviour within the business. It must observe what's happening in the economy. It must anticipate, ideally, what's going to happen, if that is possible, and then try to have policies and ways to accommodate the change and to enable the organisation to continue despite the upheavals that are going on in the wider economic environment. High inflation has an impact on employee relations, as I said. This calls for trade unions to take action against employee wages and their financial conditions. So I mentioned inflation having an impact on market signals and how it destroys our information within the market. We no longer know what the price of goods are because of inflation, because prices are changing so rapidly. But it's the case that workers will be able to buy less from their wages and salaries when they get paid. They're able to buy less because prices in the shops have gone up. So what they receive will buy less. They are poorer as a consequence. And this, of course, can lead to trade union involvement and more pay claims on the part of the trade union to try and get compensation for inflation for their membership, which means the company will have even more increases in cost, so it must put its price up even more. So it depends really on the buying power of its customers. Can its customers continue to buy the product? Because if they can't, then these cost increases can drive the company out of business. Levels of unemployment impact on employee relations. Employees and trade unions are concerned with job security. So the wider economic environment impacts on job security, which leads to perhaps industrial issues, employee relations issues within the organisation, because the membership of the trade union will want job security if they can. They want to continue to work because they need the income to pay their family bills. So job security is an issue as well. And that's related really to what we've been saying earlier in point 2. Levels of production and GDP impacts on the organisation and the amount of trading and level of production. GDP is the gross domestic product. It's the amount of goods and services produced within the country. And changes in GDP, changes in the amount of gross domestic product, will impact on the organisation. If the economy is doing well, then GDP will be rising. This means that more workers will be required within the economy, there's more income in circulation, there's greater demand for products, there's more prosperity. Of course, if GDP rises too fast, it could lead to inflation. It could also lead to labour shortages because the best workers are snapped up by companies, leaving other companies unable to find suitable employees. So, changes in GDP impact on the organisations, and it can lead to good effects, growth within the organisation, or it could lead to bad. Key employees are lost to other companies, or key employees can't be recruited, or it could lead to inflation, as we talked about earlier. Levels of production and trading will impact on the need to recruit workers. If the needs of an organisation are not met, this will result in redundancies and staff reduction. If a company experiences a downturn in the demand for its product, it may wish to reduce the workforce, leading to redundancies and staff reduction, as I say here. So it's necessary to look at what determines the demand for the product. Now, the demand for the product may be determined by disposable income within the country. So levels of GDP will have an impact. If GDP is falling, there's less income within the country. That means there may be less demand for the products of the company, and hence redundancies. Of course, it could be the case that the product is running towards the end of its life cycle. There may be other explanations, but these are more micro explanations. When we're looking at the impact of the economic system on a company, it normally comes through in the context of demand and cost factors that impinge upon the company. Levels of production and GDP impact on the organisations and the amount of trading and level of production, as I said. It's important that the company is aware of what's likely to happen in terms of economic growth within the country or economic decline within the country, or how the structure of the economy is changing. It could be changing from manufacturing to services, for example. So it's important that the company is aware of these trends and has policies ready to implement these policies if they're needed, which will offset the worst effects of this. Of course, if the domestic market is falling, companies may be tempted into trying to find overseas sales and overseas markets, which may add to the whole issue of globalization. As I said earlier, the levels of production and trading will impact on the need to recruit workers. Recruiting workers is expensive. Companies, by and large, try to retain their workforce if their workforce are doing good jobs. But in times of rising economic prosperity, times of economic growth in the economy, some workers will be perhaps headhunted by other companies, so that there's an upward drift in pay, leaving the less efficient companies unable to pay more to their employees, and hence they will lose key workers. So weaker companies may go out of business because of economic growth. The weaker companies may experience increased demand for their product, but at the same time they're experiencing perhaps an increase in costs, labour costs, or an increase indeed in other costs, for example raw materials. So economic growth may have a bad effect on less efficient companies. But then again, economists would say, well, that's part of the weeding out process. This is the nature of capitalism, that the strong will survive and the weak will die. The weak companies will cease to exist. The strong companies will flourish and go on to even greater growth themselves. The political and legal framework. Well, political stability is important in order to create a stable industrial relations environment. It's important that the government have policies that are clearly articulated in terms of their economic policy, their social policy, and so on, so that employees can see what the government's trying to do. And the government should be stable. It shouldn't change the rules frequently, and it shouldn't interfere in the economy. This stability that the government is now engendering and bringing to bear in terms of the market and its performance, this will go across into the arena of employee relations, so that the employees will feel there's more stability in the country, their jobs are perhaps not as threatened. They will negotiate from a different agenda. They might negotiate for salary increases, but feeling quite confident that their jobs are not at risk, because the overall environment is quite stable. Sometimes governments may inadvertently cause issues, unintended consequences. When the government, for example, introduces some particular policy, perhaps some widening of the markets, international markets, so it allows imports in from some country. That country will then start to grow rapidly, perhaps, and eventually will replace domestic producers. That was not the intention of the government. The government was perhaps trying to help that country to develop, help it to grow, not to make its own people redundant. So it's important to understand the political and legal framework. Government policies identify the stability of a country. So the government policies in total is what gives the country some stability. This could be economic policy, less intervention by the government, certainly no dramatic intervention by the government, and it could cut across into social policy, no radical changes, education policy, no big changes. So the government is gently nudging the country along in the direction in which it wants to go, and that is providing stability within which businesses can flourish. Trade unions ensure that employees are treated fairly and in accordance to policies and procedures. So it's the job of the trade unions to monitor how organisations deal with their employees. And the trade unions themselves could be a moderating influence. Some employees may be treated not so well by the employers, and in order to ameliorate that, the trade unions get involved. But it could also be the case that the trade unions operate to a different agenda, which is not in accordance with stability in the country. So some members of the trade unions might want policies which are quite revolutionary, might want to change the whole economic system, which would have a bad effect, I should say, on the employment prospects within certain companies. So it could be bad employers, or it could be elements within the trade union movement which could lead to instability. But the fact that there are forums within which these various institutions can negotiate and talk, the trade unions and the management, and where agreements can be sought, there can be arbitration and reconciliation, then the overall objective can be seen as one of trying to bring about stability. The impact of legislation on employment, health and safety and global warming have an influence on employee relations and employee rights. Clearly, when the government enacts legislation relating to health and safety at work, it impinges directly on the workers. They can see the organisation having to complete new routines or introduce new technologies or engage in further training or whatever the requirement of the legislation is. So that will certainly have an immediate impact on the employees. But it could be also legislation related to global warming, perhaps the control of carbon emissions, which may require businesses to change their production systems. And changing their production systems might need more training for the employees, or it might need new employees with different competencies and different skills. So there's another situation where the political environment impinges on employee rights. The impact of future legislation and changes in policy will directly influence employee relations. If the government is proposing radical changes to its policies in the future, or if there's about to be an election where a new government is about to be voted in, perhaps, that have quite radical policies in some respects, perhaps economic policies or social policies or industrial policies, employee relations policies, if that is about to happen, it may deter investment. The investors in companies may think they're unsure about what the outcomes of all of these changes will be and whether they will still get a good return on their investment. So they may cease to invest, and if they cease to invest, that could lead to redundancies. It could lead to business closures. Organisations need to follow legal procedures in order to ensure that they are meeting employee rights. So it's important for the organisations to have skilled personnel within the HR section that can ensure that the procedures and routines of the business are in accordance with those required by the legislation. So it's not something that companies do passively. It's something that the companies must ensure that is done, and they must conform to the legislation. The concept of employee relations is dependent on changes in political and legal changes in the country. As, of course, the country changes, as governments change, as economic policy and social policy changes, as the whole structure of the economy changes, there are new, perhaps, trends even in the market, economic trends. As all of this happens, employee relations must change as well. There will be new pressures on employees to perhaps gain new skills, have more qualifications, become knowledge workers, become more adept at the use of technology, and so there's more pressure on the employees. So the employees have to flex in accordance with the way in which the economy in total is changing. So there are issues there for employee relations. Social. Well, social factors are embedded into a country and are followed by the community. Social factors can include the culture, morals, ethics, and lifestyle of the population. The social culture and the social factors, the fabric of the society, is what goes into the organisation, because the employees are also citizens of the wider society. They live and function within the wider society. So the mores, the principles, the ethics of that society are naturally carried into the workplace. And that will influence their understanding of the requirements of management. It'll impinge upon their requirements in terms of negotiations for salary, working conditions, health and safety, training, job security. So they're getting these opinions from the wider society. So the wider society is, in a sense, what determines employee relations. Social factors impinge on the way an organisation operates. As I said, it's in accordance to the work culture and norms and expectations. This point number 2 is slightly different to point number 1 in the sense that the wider society is what influences the employees in terms of their approach to work and their approach to employee relations. But organizations themselves can generate miniature cultures. They can have their own small culture. That small culture may be determined by the production process, determined by their attitudes towards quality, their attitudes towards discipline at work, towards routines at work. So there is another layer to culture, and that is the culture of the organisation, the way in which work operates within the business, the way work is carried out, the culture of the business. The culture of the business could be the way management see the employees and talk to them and consult them, and or does the management completely ignore them, simply give orders? So when we think about the social issues, we have these very wide principles coming in from outside, the ethic of the wider society, the norms of the wider society coming in, that the employees naturally carry with them from their experiences in the wider society into the company. But then there's also this other layer which is determined inside the organisation. So the final negotiations between employees and management over issues will be very complex. It'll have elements of principles that are coming in from the outside. It'll also recognise the importance of procedures and ways of working and establish cultures within the organisation. Population, demographics and lifestyle changes means that employee relations have to change policies and procedures as people's lifestyle changes. Well, employee relations must take into account the overall structure of the economy, the opportunities that there are for employees to find alternative employment if something should go wrong, if the company were to close, or if there were some issues that some employees were made redundant or whatever. But the trade union must also look at the demographics, must look at the age profile of the workers. If the workers are close to retirement age, perhaps maybe 3 or 4 years off retirement age, and are going to be made redundant, the chances of them getting another job may be very slim. So it's important that the trade union is aware of the issues that confront their membership in terms of their gender, their age, their experiences, even where they live in relationship to centres of employment and their capacity to get there, transport capacity to get there. So there are issues associated with population and demographics that need to be factored in when employees are talking to management. They need to be at least aware that there is a risk that should the negotiations go wrong, then some employees may be made redundant, and those employees, by virtue of their age or gender or race, may find it difficult to find employment. So that has to be factored in to negotiations. Levels of education impacts on employee relations. For example, countries such as China and India have a massive labour force and manual workers. Employment contracts and employees' needs will differ. So education impacts on employee relations. Generally speaking, production processes are becoming more and more complex because of the advent of better technology, which requires more understanding on the part of the employees to succeed in modern production methods. So we have computer-aided manufacturing, for example. We have the introduction of robotics into many parts of industry. And the employees work in conjunction with the machines. So there are issues about the recruitment and retention of skilled and intelligent workers. Now, in countries like China and India, as I said, they have a massive population, many of whom will be manual workers. So the approach to employee relations in those countries may be totally different to the approach adopted in a country where there is a high degree of mechanization and computerization and the different skill sets. So different employees will approach employee relations differently. Some employees will be concerned perhaps with wages, with job security. In other countries it may revolve around salaries, job security, conditions of employment, training, access to training programs. So there may be different issues in different countries. Organizations' culture and people's attitudes to work will create the need for employee relations to meet different needs. Clearly the case that as the wider society, the culture of the wider society impacts on individuals and they get to understand the wider processes within the society and the benefits of having a more caring, compassionate society and the benefits of having education and promoting that sort of agenda. This is taken into the workplace. So people's attitudes towards work will change. And the employees will have different sets of needs. If the culture of the society is one which is not highly developed, perhaps bordering on indifference, the workplace is broadly ignored perhaps by government or by the society. If that's the case, then there will be more emphasis on remuneration and less emphasis on health and safety, on holiday entitlements, on sick leave, on maternity leave, and so on. It's when the society develops and there's more understanding of the importance of issues such as motivation at work, more holidays, better remuneration, health and safety. When there's more understanding of this and it's built into the culture, then that's moved into the workplace, and now the negotiations, employee relationships, will involve discussion of health and safety and so on, all of these wider issues. So clearly the content of employee relations will be a function of the degree to which the wider society has taken on board these other issues. Technological. Well, advancements in technology and machinery may be more efficient than labour. And it's often the case that machines simply are more efficient. They can run 24/7. They don't have holidays. They may break down from time to time, but with regular maintenance they will work continuously. People can't do that. So some people may be, in a sense, reduced down to tendering to the machine, making sure that the machine has got the appropriate raw materials, that it's working properly and it's in good working order. So the people are maintaining the machine, which of course means that the tasks that the people are asked to perform are very straightforward, very boring tasks, perhaps. Just making sure the machine is okay and it's clean and running properly, and go in the morning, perhaps press the on button, and the machine works all day. And it works perhaps better than humans could. It works to better tolerances and has more consistent output and has the capacity to work faster. So there are issues associated with the introduction of technology into the workplace. Employees may find that their roles are becoming increasingly marginalized. They themselves are, as I said, working for the machine. And as more sophisticated routines are discovered and developed, as there's new breakthroughs in technology and better programming and so, this is likely to increase. And the long-run impact of this is very unclear. Could it be the case that industry in the future will be manned by machines? But if that's the case, then who will buy the output of industry? Because workers will not have the income because they're not needed. So who will buy the output of industry if the industry is composed almost entirely from machines? These may be almost science fiction type speculations, but they're real, and they're becoming more real as we see more and more robotics and more automation being introduced into industry. Global communications and the internet has opened many opportunities and threats for organizations. It's the case that the internet makes communications instantaneous. So companies are able to globalize, they're able to open new plants in other countries and run the new plants just like they would run their existing business in their indigenous country. They have instantaneous contact with the other company. They can problem solve from a distance, they can give directions, and they can review policies, and they can do inspection tours of the company if need be. So this will have an impact on employee relations. If some countries have cheaper labour than others, which they do, then companies may move to the cheap labour countries. And if companies move there, then employee relations in the indigenous country may suffer. the workforce in the original company will feel threatened, will feel that their jobs are under threat, they'll feel not so motivated towards the company. They won't feel as loyal towards the company. They'll see the company as cultivating new markets, new possibilities in other countries. And all of this, as I said, is facilitated by better communications systems. Efficient transport and delivery systems means that organizations have an efficient logistical system, and that may reduce the need for staff. Perhaps in the past the company distributed its product by having delivery people, delivery personnel, but it wasn't very organized. Now, with tracking systems, the logistics manager knows where the vehicles are, they know what progress the vehicles are making, they know when the items are about to be delivered. They can even inform the recipients in advance of the delivery and say that the delivery will take place in the next 15 minutes, for example. So there's much more information about delivery as well, and better planning, because better tools exist, better maps, and areas of congestion can be flagged up, and so the drivers, let's say, of trucks or of vehicles know which roads to avoid by simply looking at the map. The map can go red and say there's a blockage on the road, so find an alternative route. So they know in advance what the conditions are, which leads to much greater efficiency. But there may be less staff required, and the threat of redundancies is ever present as more and more breakthroughs come in these areas. It's not just logistics, having said that. This cuts all the way across all the functions of the company, as better communication systems, better technology, better programs, perhaps better software, better hardware, as these are introduced throughout the company, there are more efficiencies to be gained, and the greater is the possibility of future redundancies. So these are some of the general issues that we can associate with the wider business environment and employee relations within an organization. It's wise to go back over this and have a look at it again, and make some notes and make sure you're familiar with the ways in which the wider environment, in terms of economics, social, technological, legal, political, how that wider environment can impinge on employee relations within an organization. So make sure you've got a set of notes that link these points, and you can discuss how these wider environmental issues can impinge on an organization. But that's all we're going to deal with here, so I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.